Hello, everyone, and welcome to Café New Canadians. Today, we'll be talking about decoding the hiring process in Canada, and we'll be speaking with recruiters who will share honest insights with you about the process and also how you can deal with any obstacles that you face during that. Now, this is our chat, which is called Café New Canadians. It's a virtual chat series that's brought to you by New Canadians, which is a TV and web show. You can watch our episodes on Omni TV if you're in Canada. That's where we air those. And it focuses on everything that's related to entrepreneurship, education, employment, settlement, immigration, all those topics that matter to the immigrant audience, newcomers in Canada, or those who are planning to move to Canada. I'm Shruti Dargan. I would be moderating this session today, and I'm so pleased to welcome our guests for today. We have with us Rebecca Lee and Matthew Cohen, both recruiters with lots of experience. And of course, they can share so much from their own experiences, as well as being in the industry, interacting with newcomers, and can talk about the challenges that they have faced too. So very warm welcome to both of our guests. And before we get talking with them, I would remind the audience joining us today, whether on Zoom or YouTube, where we're live streaming this too. You can ask us your questions, and I'm sure you'll have lots. So you can use the chat box on YouTube and the Q&A tab on Zoom, and start typing your questions right away. We will come to them soon during our discussion. All right, so let's begin this session with the two guests. Very warm welcome to both of you. Rebecca and Matthew, how are you doing?
Very good. How are you?
Good. How are you?
It's been wonderful chatting with you earlier, and so pleased to have you on the session with us. As you know, the topic today is something that matters a lot to everyone looking for employment, but especially for newcomers to the country who may or may not be aware of how the hiring process really works in Canada. It could be very different from how it is in their home countries before they moved here, the experiences that they've had. Or sometimes there are misunderstandings too in the process, which make it difficult for candidates and I'm sure for recruiters as well. So that's what we'll be discussing today, to understand both sides and to be able to decode the hiring process. Rebecca, I'll start with you. Let's begin with an introduction. If you could tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, and Matthew, I'll come to you next.
Sure.
Of course, Trudy. So I'd love to tell you a little bit about my background. So I currently work as a recruitment manager at a mid-sized recruitment agency based out of Toronto. So I mostly recruit for accounting, finance, HR, operation positions from junior to senior level across the greater Toronto area. So over the past 10 years, I've really spent a lot of time doing other types of recruitment, whether it's executive search or globally based recruitment firms, as well as the consulting and trades industry. Prior to my current role, I actually spent 4 years at a non-for-profit agency called Access Employment, where I actually facilitated a number of different workshops, networking events, and really helping a lot of internationally trained professionals relaunch their career in the Toronto region. So a lot of them are in great roles right now, and I'm really proud of them. On the side, I also collaborate with different organizations such as the Rotman School of Management for their business ed program. So it is a career advancement program for internationally trained professionals looking to advance their careers. I also do other webinars and also podcasts as well on the side. So a little bit of me outside of work, I also do like to travel a lot. Pre-COVID, and I do like to experience different cultures and also spend a lot of times in different off the beaten path areas in different countries, including Egypt, Jordan, Thailand, Chile, Spain. I think there's many other countries I've been to as well. So I do love to travel and hope to do that again soon. So just want to thank you so much, Shruti and Jordan, for just having us today. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. Matthew, how about you? Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So currently I'm in-house recruiter for one of the largest Canadian media and content companies at the moment. Prior to that, I worked on the agency side of things and in-house, majority with the IT tech, marketing, digital marketing kind of field. At the moment, mostly it's corporate recruiting. So that's all the departments when it comes to finance, IT, accounting, legal, and all mid to senior level roles or any kind of mission critical roles or kind of roles I'm working on at the moment. Prior to that, in the beginning of my career, I did work with international students at one of the international educational institutions. So seeing some of the newcomers from Canada get their education and succeed either going to a more current university or finding a job locally and staying in Canada and thriving is kind of have been very interesting and very rewarding experience back then. And then in terms of personal side, I love doing anything sports related. So last night was volleyball night, and then also skating later today. Anything to do with baseball or softball I'm in as well. And that's just a little bit about myself.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm sure that this helps our audience understand so much more about you, and they'll have all the right questions based on your experiences as well. So let's now talk about the big thing which we have to discuss, which is the hiring process in Canada. It is daunting to a lot of individuals who may or may not be aware of it. So let's break it down. Let's begin with Rebecca, Matthew, whoever would like to begin with this. Tell us a little bit about the timelines. So when it comes to the hiring process in Canada, typically what is it like? Or maybe let's begin with, if you see from your experience any particular differences in how hiring happens in the other countries. Is there something stark that stands out that you'd like to highlight first? Matthew, let's begin with you this time.
Sure. So in terms of timeline, it really depends on the opportunity. So it also depends on the hiring manager's availability. So sometimes the timelines can be quick, depending if you go through agency. Sometimes usually that's a little bit more quicker because there's a sense of urgency behind that. However, on the corporate side, if you're applying for any kind of large organizations, the process might be a little slowed down because there's processes in place in the back end that you might not see as a candidate. So that could be including approvals of getting the roles on, waiting at least 2 weeks for the role to be posted because that's the policy sometimes. And then depending on the hiring manager's availability to kind of sift through the resumes and then reach out to potential candidates. So that process on average, I think is about 55 days overall until end to end from beginning to, getting an offer letter in front of the candidates. So that's kind of my 2 cents in terms of like how many factors can add up to increasing that timeline and might not be as fast as the candidate might want sometimes.
Yeah. I'm sure that, there are more details that we would be talking about. All of these factors that you mentioned, we would be diving deep into those factors. Rebecca, your thoughts on what I just asked Matthew. Typically, what are those differences that you may have noticed?
Yeah, so I do agree with Matthew. It does depend on the job, right? And when you're looking at a corporate recruitment versus agencies, people come to agencies a lot for more urgent positions. So sometimes they can be contractual positions, right? What that means is that it is a certain project or a certain urgent need that may be filling for maternity leave. Anything like that, I find it could be a very quick fill with a 1 interview basis, and then starting within, the next 2-3 days even, right? So those types of positions are a lot more quicker to fill. But if it's something that is, Matthew mentioned that it's a lot more of a permanent position, more, longer, like 3-prong kind of interview, that can take a lot longer coordinating with the different hiring managers' schedules. And it does depend if it's an in-person interview versus a virtual interview as well. So I'd probably say like 2 to 3 weeks around just in terms of filling that. And it does depend on the priorities. And some positions, they may be a proactive research, so recruit. So it's always good to always ask the recruiter, how soon are they looking to fill that position? That's the best way to find out the timelines.
So from a job posting, I'm just wondering that, sometimes if those job postings say that we're looking to hire and fill this position immediately, some others sometimes are postings that you don't really understand if they have a vacancy right away, or they're just trying to kind of assess candidates, test the market to see exactly what kind of candidates are out there. In these 2 different situations, does the timeline get affected? Are these timelines different for the 2 processes? Matthew?
Obviously because that's the dependency in terms of the hiring manager's need for the person to start maybe in December or start yesterday is the usual kind of internal comments that I get. We'd love someone yesterday. Obviously, it does take time to find individuals, but if it's a general posting, the timeline does usually extends it unless they state that, hey, we want all these individuals to start in the Q1 of 2022, for example. Then obviously, then that you have an estimated timeline. If it doesn't have something posted like that, then it's safe to assume that hopefully they want to hire you as soon as possible, as long as you get through the entire interview process.
Yeah. And Rebecca, if you were to now, give a general kind of a timeline from start to end as to basically an introduction of sorts to newcomers to Canada about the hiring process. So what would you say when the job posting goes out? What happens before that on your end? How soon are you told by the employers that, okay, we have this job posting, posted right away, start screening candidates right away? Or is there like a preparation period there too? What's that like? After the job posting is there, then how long does it take? And if you could take us through the stages as well.
Yeah, so it does depend on the job and all of that. And from a more of an agency perspective, I'm sure that Matthew can comment a little bit more on the company corporate perspective. But once we do get a position from one of the companies that we do work with, we call them clients. So if that does happen, we usually post that right away because it usually is urgent. But that always comes with something called an intake meeting. So what that means is that we do get all of the requirements, we get the salary expectations, we get a lot of the location and everything else in terms of the technical experiences or the non-technical experiences needed. So, what we do is then we start posting that, on our job website. We might start posting on social media, depending on kind of what means we are looking for to recruit, and then usually within 1 or 2 days, we start getting applicants in. So I always say it's always best to apply within like the first, I would say 1 to 3 days usually of a job posting. Just make sure you get seen depending on how popular that position is. If it's an accountant versus a software developer, it does depend on the type of people that come in. But usually when we get a posting like an accountant, we get tons of people applying for that. It's a very common job. So I would probably say apply within that time, and you can get called within 1 or 2 weeks, depending on how urgent that position is. Do keep in mind that when we are posting, there are multiple positions we're working on. So sometimes one is a more urgent position versus another, and you can't tell that online. So always apply within that time. Within 1 or 2 weeks, you likely hear a call, maybe 3 weeks, 4 weeks, but that would be a bit more of a longer process. So after that happens, when I do reach out and I'm interested, that will probably be a phone screen first. That usually is the minimal requirement just to meet the experiences and everything that's looking for. And then usually within, I would say, a week or so, you will likely be contacted if there is a second round interview, and that's usually with the hiring manager. So from there, depends on the company, how big it is. There's usually another round perhaps with probably a more senior level VP or someone that is more of the head of the department, or maybe the hiring manager may be able to decide that on their own as well, or maybe another HR person. So I'll probably say 2 to 3 round interviews, and then after that, there might be a case study or maybe a test after that. And I'll probably say that'll be the end and then an offer. So that's kind of the very bare bones of the stages. Those can take a span of 2 to 3 weeks, and it does depend on background checks and also references as well. So hopefully that kind of clarifies. I know it's very bare bones, but in general, that's kind of how that works on our side.
Yeah, that gives a good enough idea to begin with, for sure. And I'm guessing that a recruiter in this case would be involved in all of these stages, right?
Yes.
So is there something specific about, your roles that you would want to highlight? Matthew, I'd ask you this based on your experience, because through the session today, we're trying to understand both sides. There is some confusion that happens in the process, and there is misunderstanding. Maybe sometimes candidates feel that, it's taking way too long, or I'm not hearing back from them. So this is an opportunity for us to understand both sides and hear from you. Our session says honest insights from recruiters. So honestly, tell us, what are those concerns that you may have during this process, or what is your involvement like as a recruiter?
Sure. So sometimes it's on our end that you don't see is we're chasing down hiring managers to get the job posting up, or we're chasing them down to get feedback. So we might have helped them select, hey, here's 10 resumes, hiring manager, which ones you like? And then they don't answer because they're busy. They have their own projects, they have their own priorities. Sometimes hiring might not be number one on their priority, even though they say they want that person yesterday. So these are some of the challenges that we face on our side that you don't really see as a candidate, right? Even chasing them down for feedback, or even after interviews, some of them, because they might miraculously be on vacation or they were sick. Any kind of small factors like that could kind of adjust that. Hey, usually I try to promise, hey, within the next week or two, we'll get back to you. And sometimes the promise is broken because the hiring manager goes missing on me some days. Once in a blue moon, that does happen. And that those are kind of factors that we can't control as recruiters. So sometimes we just have to get back to them like, hey, we're trying to get a hold of them. But that's why sometimes the feedback or like next round could be delayed, or maybe they're coming up with an assignment, whether it's a writing test or a small case study, and they need another 2 days to write that up before sending it out to the final couple candidates they want to kind of bring on potentially. So
yeah. And so, Rebecca mentioned volume of applications too, that sometimes when the posting is out in the first few weeks, or sometimes I've noticed on the very first day, you have like more than 200, 300 applicants already, especially on job posting sites and, sites like, say, LinkedIn. You're able to see how many people have already applied for it. So tell us a little bit about how the volume of applications also affects the process. And if you think you'd be able to share a number with us, for an example, if you see 100 applications, how many are likely to be shortlisted for a position? And, how does that process go on at the different stages? Rebecca, and feel free, I'd ask both of you to just jump in whenever you feel that there is something that you'd want to add. So Rebecca, I'll ask you first.
Sure. Yeah. So I think it does depend on the job. I don't think we see 200 applications all the time. That would be great. But usually some of these positions are quite difficult to fill. So I'll probably say, depending on the applicants, like just say if there were 50 people that applied, right? We'll do probably a quick screen, seeing who it is and all of that. But I'd probably say I would not want to present more on my end, more than like 6, max 10 people over to the hiring manager out of that. So that could go through different screens, maybe 15 to 20 phone screens, depending on what it is and how specific that job is. So I know there's a lot of answers of it depends, but it does depend on what it is. A more technical position versus a more administrative role, like a receptionist, right? So I think that that's kind of the challenge, of that. Sometimes we literally just get 2 applicants. If it's say a trilingual, customer service person that speaks English, French, and Spanish, right? So, if you are the one, you are the only one, right? So I think it does depend on that type of position. And I'm sure Matthew can chime in a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Also depends on the variety. Number of spots to fill. So sometimes, recently, we had to fill 5 in inside sales reps. So obviously, we had to present a little bit more than your average of 6 to 10. Because on average, I also do the same. I don't want to keep it simple. So usually 6 to 10 go to the hiring manager, and they choose the top, let's say 5 to 6 for phone screens. And at that point, I'll just jump and do phone screens and conduct those calls. But it really depends. If the role has 5, then also we present a lot more, because we want to have a larger, room for error potentially, in case some candidates don't work out or they drop off in the process. As noted with Rebecca saying that 50 is kind of average nowadays. Haven't seen 200 in a long time, because the market's kind of been really hot for an employee or potential candidates. So we're not getting as many applicants, and lately the trend has been hiring managers reaching out and say, hey, why don't we only have 10, 15, or if they're lucky, 50 applicants. So if for those listening, that's a good opportunity for you to apply to everything, because your chances are pretty high, knowing that a lot of people are being seeked out by employers. So when you see a job posting, apply, especially if it's in the first 2 weeks of being live, for sure.
And I just wanted to add as well, just because you're late on your application, still apply, because you never know. Although I do say apply within the first, 3 days or so, right? Those are for so-called popular jobs, but We also may have multiple positions, like Matthew said. So just because you applied for one thing doesn't mean that that position filled. I can still look at your resume on our job portal, right? And then I can consider you for the other inside sales rep position, right? So I think that don't shy away just because you see that and it's been 5 days. I think there's a lot of applicants. Still put it in because you never know, right? What happens.
Exactly. And I noticed one thing with a lot of newcomers that I've interacted with on LinkedIn. They always reach out to, hey, I'm interested in this job, and then I look them up in the system, like, but you haven't applied yet. So it's great to try to get some FaceTime with hiring managers or recruiters, and if we have time, love to chat with everyone. But obviously, there's only so many hours in a day. However, the most important thing is to make sure that your resume, your name, your phone number is in the system. So at least eventually, if we see you a week later, you're in there. But if you see your message a week later, you might have missed the boat in terms of your resume being seen by us or being seen by a hiring manager for that particular role as well.
Yeah. And I hope that, clears the timelines to the audience as well. And at this point, I'd, of course, also tell them that do ask your questions. Now that you understand the timelines, I'm sure you have particular situations that you've been in that you would want our recruiters today to be answering those. Back to you, Matt, I wanted to just ask you, so I'm assuming that, as a recruiter, you'd be the first person viewing all of these job applications that come in, besides, of course, I believe the applicant tracking system as well.
Mm-hmm.
Or are there other people also who would screen it, bring it down to a certain number, and then you shortlist from that?
So sometimes I don't work on 100% of the roles that are at my company. So in those cases, the hiring manager does their own screening, or maybe one of the associates. I've noticed a couple of hiring managers that have say a team lead or a senior member of the team that has access to all the resumes and would review on behalf of their manager, or the managers would roll up their sleeves and review the resumes themselves, right? So sometimes when people reach out to me, hey, I'm interested in this accounting job, I'm like, I'm not working on that one. The hiring manager is actually reviewing resumes on their own, so please apply as soon as you can, because I'm pretty sure that they will be looking at resumes in the next week or two. And then if you happen to get a call, then they sometimes do the process on their own. I don't necessarily have to have my hands on every single role that goes on in my company, and we don't have enough bandwidth to oversee the 150 potential open roles that might be going on at the same time across all of the different departments. So. There's that as well.
And correct me now. So another factor that, in my view, affects, maybe sometimes delays the process as well, is also the manpower available on the HR side too, right? I moved to Canada from a country like India, and there my experience has been that there are teams which are much larger than teams in Canada in general. So an HR department would most likely have, say, 10 people or 20 people hiring for that position, not all together hiring for that position, but there's more people involved as well. In Canada, typically teams are smaller. So on your side, have you seen this as a challenge, or is this a factor that kind of affects the situation too?
Yeah, I would say so. Because the availability of so in my case, if you are most likely if you're a manager or higher in terms of title, or if you're leading a team, my company's policy is that they have to meet with a representative from the HR team, whether it be HR business partner, HR director, manager, or a VP if it's a very senior level role. And obviously with those individuals, depending on the business, depending on the time of year, that has delayed my process by a couple of days because of their availability, trying to book them in the busy calendar with the final, 2 candidates usually at that point to kind of determine, fit, leadership, culture kind of fit is usually what the HR interviews have been for my end. And obviously you're correct that my HR teams are about 10 to 15 strong if you include the recruiters. So we're not that large, and we're supporting over 2,000 employees across Canada. So you're right, that is another factor to delay the process a little bit as well. Yeah.
Sure.
And I think I also want to add, it also depends on the type of role. And also sometimes you don't know in the background, but there are changes in terms of the requirements as well, or, we may go out there and you actually have one really great candidate, but the hiring manager is insisting on seeing a couple more comparisons, right? So, in that sense, you don't know that, but going into second rounds or final rounds, and you're stuck there and you're wondering, why am I still waiting for 2-3 weeks? It's not likely because, we might even wouldn't be busy. We just really busy trying to find another you, right? Just to compare, just so that we have peace of mind to know that we've done our due diligence in going through the market to finding that best candidate for the hiring manager. So I think that it's just more important to just have, I guess we'll go into that topic later, but recruiters and candidates to really have that open communication, because there's so many factors that cause delays that you just don't see, just being that person in that hiring process.
And to what you just said, Rebecca, that reminds me of something that I've heard way too many times since I moved, which is in Canada, one is slow to hire and slow to fire. That is something that I've heard a lot, which kind of explains why the process takes maybe a little longer than what newcomers would expect. But then there's also some kind of job security after you're there, because there is this effort made to hire the right candidate. But what are your thoughts? Because sometimes that may not always be the case, right? So do you agree with this, that it is like this, that slow to hire and slow to fire? And what are the reasons for it? Rebecca?
Yeah. So, I personally have not heard this exact term, but I see where that could come from, right? I mean, it does depend on the sector, I think, because there, again, like some sectors are a lot more slower to hire. For example, more maybe public sector or government, more regulated sectors, there's a lot of different checks that take place and even clearances that need to happen, right? So it does depend. And again, also for permanent versus contract needs, right? So the reason why it is slower to hire is also because fit is really important. And in Canada, it's not just about technicals, right? Sure, I can look for someone with very good Excel, right? Or very good SAP skills or something like that. But if they don't have that personality that is able to connect with that team, if they're not able to lead that team as a manager, if they're not able to communicate specifically, how, certain things are run, and they have there's a lot of different factors on the soft skills side as well. So I think looking at someone holistically, it does take a longer time, because it's not just a fact of like a checklist and saying, do you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and you're in, right? But it's a lot more than that. And I think some places in other countries, it may be very skill based. And I've seen that, and very much like Rebecca, like I have all 5 things, I'm perfect fit, right, for this position, but if you are rude in the interview, you are arrogant, you are entitled, asking for something like $20,000 more than the actual salary range, or you just don't sound like someone that can really manage and motivate a team for a managerial position. Those things can really affect that long term. And when you're actually spending costs in training somebody, investing in a lot of that time, and also even reposting that and having to rehire that, it's very costly for a company. So I think being able to mitigate that risk is very important. Slow to fire, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I think we're very KPI based in Canada. So I think just because you know me as a friend or somebody XYZ, I don't feel that they'll keep you in a company for no reason. You would have to really meet your key performance indicators and goals. And if not, I would not think anyone would hesitate to fire you without, well, obviously there are warnings and different stages of doing that, but I don't think that someone would be, slow to fire, just from my own opinion. And maybe Matthew might have something different to say.
Well, and I'm just thinking there's a couple of thoughts that come up in my mind. So knowing some larger companies, the slow to fire can be true, because that you have to think of tenure, actual cause to fire, and the package you have to give out. So my wife works for a very large company as well, and I've heard stories where someone, because they have 15 years tenured, they're underperforming, but we can't fire her because the package would be too big. So they just moved the individual to a different team. So I've seen stuff like that happen. Another factor that my partner at work deals with is unions. So unions add an extra layer of complication, whether it be you have to post it a certain way, you need to make sure that they fill all these other extra requirements on top of the usual what's on the job description. So unions might slow that down, and also slows down the firing process, as well as most people are aware. Unions like to protect their employees. So that, I've never really heard that phrase myself either. However, some of it can be true depending on kind of the company. If they're large or unionized, for example, that could play a factor. And then same thing with everything Rebecca has pointed out. I totally agree in terms of the processes, for hiring and potentially, letting people go, right?
Yeah. So I'm seeing a few audience questions which are around understanding the expectations that hiring managers and recruiters have at the different stages of the job application and hiring process. So let's briefly discuss that. When you see a job post or when you post a job posting and there are applications that come in, typically does it go through an ATS system, the applicant tracking system in most companies? In your experience, would you say that? Or are there still companies that directly just check the applications and don't depend on that?
Well,
Matthew, from your experience or your current role right now, if you could tell us.
I can start. So for my current company, my ATS system is very bare bones. So meaning that I manually have to review each resume. There's no search function. In the past, Rebecca can probably attest to this one. Some applicant tracking systems have a search function, whether it be search for keywords, whether you can sort them or search them by names, or have a Boolean search. So you have, these are the top 5 skill sets I want to see in a resume, or if you're looking for a CPA, for example, so a designation of any sort that you might have, make sure it's spelled out, or include both acronym and spelled out words, because those are words that we'd be looking for. And I'm aware of large companies that have advanced applicant tracking systems that are automated that might filter out because the job description has these 20 words. Let's look for them through the resume. So for really, really big, maybe Fortune 500 companies, they may have an applicant tracking system like that have an automated kind of maybe AI that does kind of filter through resumes before they get to eyeballs of the hiring manager or the respective recruiter.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so a question from Habib, who's joining us via YouTube, is how much weight do you typically put on cover letters in an application? Resumes, of course, are the main document, but Rebecca, I'd ask you this.
Yeah, so I would probably say it depends again, for the position, but I would say safe to say 99% I do not read cover letters. So, I mean, if you have a nice introductory email and they're sending it to me because you saw me posting something on LinkedIn or something like that, I think that's nice just to introduce yourself and just say, I'm interested, here's my resume. But there's no need to do, a full flowery 1-pager, 4-paragraph cover letter for me, because in the end, I'm still going to look at your resume, right? And I think that is more of the intent. So I think the more important thing is really just to focus and make sure that your resume is targeted. I know that I am a big, advocate for that. It's just really being able to make sure those keywords are in there. And Matthew did allude to that as well, making sure your designations and everything are visible. But in the end, we get such a high volume of applicants every day. We're not going to read through and comb through an entire cover letter. In terms of what my opinion is.
I think for cover letters, for me, I agree with Rebecca. 99% of the time, I don't I really read cover letters unless I happen to be on a very junior role when it comes to a student who's a fresh graduate, went internship or an entry-level role. That's the only time I look into cover letters, because I get that the students, they're fresh grads from their respective educational institutions, so they don't have a lot of experience. So the cover letter helps exemplify maybe some volunteer experience, maybe some of their hobbies that might interact with this role, and maybe some co-ops. So I think that's the only time where I actually read cover letters thoroughly, or for students usually, or any entry-level roles, to where they can kind of showcase that's something a resume can't really show, because the resume will say, I graduated, and that's not a whole lot to go off of, right? So, but most of the time, 9 out of 10, we usually skip past cover letters for other roles. Yeah.
One thing I would add though, is if those of you that are listening, if you do have a landing date, or if you are a PR status or your work permit status, I would say indicate that on your resume if that is the case, because when we do get applicants that are highly skilled and we don't know whereabouts you are and when you're coming here, that's also harder for us to screen you. So instead of doing, again, a big cover letter about that, you can always write a quick email if you do have my email address about that, but usually it's best just to kind of include that in your application, just to state clearly what your status is, and what your, planned landing date is.
Yeah. Now that you mentioned, newcomers, those who are in different countries may not have already landed in Canada. There's a question also about international experience. So newcomers bring with them international experience a few years or many years, decades of experience sometimes, and then they're looking for roles over here. So a question from someone joining us on YouTube is, how do you see any relevant international experience? Any tips that how a candidate could highlight that, or what is it specifically that you look for when you're comparing their international experience with what you might find in candidates here? Matthew, your thoughts on this?
I'm thinking like if it's transferable kind of skill set, if it's not tied to something that's localized or legal, if it's you're looking for a contract manager that only does Canadian law, it's a little bit hard to find that transferable skill. And some people I've spoken to in the past with international experience, they would showcase that, hey, I'm studying up on kind of Canadian laws to kind of make up for that kind of missing kind of barrier. But for other roles that are more typical and transferable, doesn't matter which country you got your experience from. So especially like IT and sometimes even marketing, if it's not just marketing in terms of local areas, but marketing in general, there's a lot of skills and traits in there that's super transferable to Canadian companies, and it's also the viewpoint it's an interesting kind of invisible barrier that I find. Some people might not see the same value. Some hiring managers might be stuck in their own ways, and that's possible with some clients or clients in the past, or hiring managers might not see it the same way. And you just have to educate them and open their eyes to that as well. As a recruiter, it's our responsibility to showcase, hey, there's multiple talents. It might not have to be from Toronto. It could be from across the country or across the world, right? So.
Yeah.
I agree with that. And I think it's more important. It's not the fact that focus that, oh, you know what, I might not be considered because I don't have Canadian specific experience. I think it's about more of their transferable skills. So how do you come across in the interview, right? Sometimes I can't even tell if someone doesn't have Canadian experience because the way they convey themselves, they worked in globalized organizations. They worked in large consulting firms that, have actually worked with Canada, right? Or the US in the past. And that command of the English language, the way that they conduct themselves and their knowledge of the different cultures was so attractive. I didn't even know, that they have never even had a full role here in Canada. So I think it's more of that kind of match to kind of, integrate well with the team, and if you have, ideas of the Canadian customs, the Canadian workplace culture, I think that should be more of that to what really work on versus I don't have Canadian experience specifically, and that's my barrier, right? And I think another thing is also, look into what's needed. So if you do have, say, for example, a CA, like a chartered accountant, from say India, right? That is very hard to obtain, right? So, if that is something that you're looking to do in influencer accounting, maybe that is actually getting your CPA equivalency here, right? And actively pursuing that so that you can also get some experience and knowledge from the Canadian taxation perspective. So I think like being able to know what those look like and the education transferability is important. Another thing I also want to touch upon is also job title. We search a lot on job title, and country manager does not resonate here. So we don't know what that means, or deputy, or I don't know, XYZ. And I think that looking up an equivalent title to what you're doing in Canada, you might want to put that in brackets in your resume. So that way the person that's looking at that, they'll actually understand and say, oh, you know what, that's actually equivalent to a senior accountant, in Canada. So I think going on Indeed, going online, seeing actually what your job overseas right now is equivalent to in the title here, that would really help educate the recruiter and helping them also pitch you to their hiring manager. So hopefully that helps as well.
Yeah, a quick point to Rebecca's,
Sure.
just CA to CPA, put that in your resume. I've seen a couple of people where they say, I have my CA in India and I'm in pursuit with CPA. And adding that to your resume helps a long way in terms of us understanding, hey, you're already in the process, and you'd be a good hire because in the next year or two, you'll have your CPA equivalent or your Canadian accounting designation, for example. So make sure you add that on your resume as well, because that does help in the long run for sure.
Yeah. There's a specific question which is about a financial analyst role. I know this could be something that you might have a lot to say on, but if you were to share 2 tips for Sarah, who's asking us that she's been invited as a financial analyst to the second round of interviews with the HR manager, who she believes is also the financial controller. So she's asking, how should she prepare the interview questions for the second round? If both of you had to give a tip each, what would it be? I see Matthew's thinking, so Rebecca, I'll come to you first.
So if you were to prepare something for second rounds and you're with the hiring manager, this is not specific to a financial analyst per se, right? But think about the top 3 reasons why they should hire you. What is your value going in, right? A lot of times people say, I'm a quick learner, I am very smart, I am hardworking. These are very generic, right? So look at the job posting, take a look at some of those qualifications that they're looking at, and think about, out of all the 50 or so candidates, why would they hire you as someone that is their financial analyst, right? So that could be your passion for numbers, right? That could be your banking experience, right? That could also be something along the lines of certain expertise that they really need, that you've gathered from your first interview. So I think that, really communicating your value at this point is important, and not being generic with your experience. So that would be one thing I would say, think about, why should we hire you?
To bounce off that, I'm thinking go for kind of maybe culture fit at that point, because with the manager and with the team, if you're able to do a little bit of research and maybe ask some questions around, hey, I noticed on your website that you have these 6 core values, and I'm really interested in this one, and how does that resonate with the team? So because you got to think of a general tip, interviews it's a 2-way street, right? So they're interviewing you to make sure, hey, are you suitable for this role? But you also got to interview them and be like, are you right for me and what I need to do and what I want in terms of my career? So I guess my tip would be kind of like the reverse angle from your point of view. If you look at a company website, there are certain things that you want to ask about in terms of culture fit, or just the kind of that kind of perspective. I think that'd be very beneficial for you to make a more educated assumption in terms of if this company is the right fit for you and your needs as well.
Yeah. Now, another thing that we wanted to touch upon in this session is, we've talked about the hiring process, the timelines, the interviews, and all of that. Now, during these different stages, and typically after the interview stage, sometimes what would happen is that the recruiter now went ahead with another candidate and did not convey it to others who may have also been interviewed for the second round, third round, and are waiting to hear from them. Or sometimes, because the process might be taking long, another candidate had 2 interviews and decided to go with a different company. And now that they don't require this position anymore, they decide not to show up for it. This phenomenon typically would be called ghosting, as it is popular. And we'd also want to touch upon this. So, Rebecca, I'd ask you, besides the different factors that we have discussed today, which affect the timelines of, the interview stage or hiring process in general, what are some of the reasons that may contribute to ghosting? If you were to talk from the recruiter's perspective, does it happen? How often does it happen? What affects it? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that it does depend on circumstances, and I just think that it depends on the person and the intention of the recruiter, right? I think that it's important to not take things personally per se, because a lot of times we don't see what's going on in the background, but at the same time, it is our duty to communicate, to candidates, on an ethical basis, especially if someone is actually, in the process. So I wanted just to touch upon, what ghosting is not before I answer that. So if you're applying for a job and you don't hear back, it is unspoken that you don't hear back within 3 to 4 weeks, likely your profile was not shortlisted. So that is not the meaning of ghosting. So general rule is if you don't hear back, from just a job application, there was no initial interaction, that's not ghosting, right? But if you're in the interview process, and you don't hear back, if I've actually engaged you in some type of communication and you don't hear back, that's more considered the ghosting side, right? So I think if that is the case, likely that could be something maybe high volume. I know that Matthew and I really alluded to the volumes of jobs that we work on. It would just be simply forgetting to reply and working on multiple things. So that could just be, a phone call just to follow up, just to make sure that we did actually, see your emails. Sometimes it could also be, I feel I'm asking too many complicated questions over email versus something could have been addressed over the phone. And because sometimes we just have that recruiter brain where we're really just busy on a day-to-day basis. So we might not have that time to really think about the complex answer to your question. So that may also be the case as well. Again, and keep your answers really brief and simple. I think that could help to prevent a little bit more of that ghosting. Sometimes we just simply don't have a response yet. So I think similar to what Matthew mentioned, like we're just chasing the hiring manager right now for feedback. Yes, it is definitely our role to inform you throughout that process, and that is not right. But sometimes, unfortunately, recruiters just do not have a response and they just don't want to communicate that for any reason, right? And other things, I mean, this happened to me before, but I mean, for personal reasons, I did actually ghost someone, but my sister was in labor. So I had to actually leave, right? And actually deal with that. And I had to come back to the candidate 3 days later because I was in an emergency labor situation and I was the only family member here. So I think that, you have to kind of keep in mind some of the other things as a holistic view, and a lot of times it's actually not malicious. It's just simply there are a lot of things going on in the background. But if you've tried many times to knock on the door and they don't come back, then maybe it's better just to move on to a different recruiter, unfortunately. So that would just be my explanation on that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Matthew, I'd ask you, based on what Rebecca just shared, if you could now talk a little bit about the timelines for a process like this. So if you were to interview me today and I ask you in my interview, how soon can I hear back from you about the interview? What would your answer be? Should I typically expect to hear back inside a week, a few days, a few weeks?
So it depends how well aligned I am with my hiring manager some days. So if they are on the ball and that they're really passionate about hiring this position, I have confidence to say that, hey, within the next week, I can give you information. The safer answer is maybe the next 2 weeks, given that some of the hiring managers might be a bit more lackluster in terms of response. But if the hiring manager I worked with in the past and I know they're really gung-ho and they're really on the ball, I say within about a week. I sometimes give them a time, hey, by the way, you're the first person I'm speaking with. You had to give me 5 more days to speak with the other candidates and then allow a couple more days for the hiring manager to, and then that's the ideal timeline. And hopefully by 7 days later, I can give you at least a yes or a no response. And then, obviously things that you can't control, hiring manager ghosted me for a couple of days and then I get back to you a few days later. That has happened. And I know there's a lot of, ghosting is kind of a commonality out there with a lot of companies. I've personally been ghosted. 2 months later, I'm like, I interviewed twice. Right? So there like Rebecca stated a lot of kind of valid factors from kind of personal experience, and I've heard of my friends also having the same problem, and that's not okay. That from my personal perspective, I always get back, even if it's a week late, even if it's a couple of days late, at least some sort of response, because the candidate took time to have a call with you, have an interview with you. You should take 2 minutes of your time to send them a quick email and be like, hey, you didn't make it, sorry, better luck next time. At least they have some sort of closure. Then open-ended, 2 months later, am I still being considered? And that's also says a lot about the company potentially, but obviously don't take it personally and don't look into it too hard that, oh, this is the worst company we're on, I never want to work for them again. It just might be, hey, maybe my sister went into labor, like Rebecca said, right? Or some other factors that are out of the recruiter's control, or maybe, it could be anything at that point.
Yeah. And when would be the right time for a candidate to follow up? So if I haven't heard from you in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and I'm still waiting eagerly for this job that I'm quite keen on, what would you say is the right time to follow up? And is there a second follow-up that is expected or is appreciated from the candidate?
I usually say within 2 weeks. I appreciate them getting back to me because, like Rebecca says, in your recruitment, you're go every day. It's something different. So sometimes I really appreciate one day, a week or two later, like, hey, so I had a phone call with you last week. Any updates? And then at that point, it also helps me prompt, hey, hiring manager, I had 2 candidates reach out to me yesterday saying, hey, they're looking for an update. I'm looking for an update. Can we get one yes, no, maybe? And then give them a quick update. And it kind of keeps that open communication with the hiring manager and with the candidate saying, hey, thank you for your email. I'm going to reach out to the hiring manager immediately. I'll give me a day or two to get a response back from them. I really appreciate you taking time to reach out. And that's usually my kind of experience when it comes to that, or like telling people, hey, make sure you if you don't hear from me within the next week or two, please feel free to send me a short email for an update in case there's a delay on my end. That's usually my go-to line, and that I usually, I stand by that, right, personally. So
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I mean, yeah, definitely let us know, because one day, I think I've heard that before. Like one day, it's like a million years, right? In a candidate's mind, but in our mind, it's just one day, right? So, I mean, please don't call me within one day, though, if you don't hear from me, right? But I think to give like 2-3 weeks and all that. But the best way is after the interview. It's always also good to say, like, if you don't get a Matthew telling you that openly, you can always say, what is the best way for me to follow up with you, right? And I think that's good, because sometimes I actually say, don't email me, just call me, right? I mean, I get too many emails. Just call me on Friday, and then I'll let you know what's the situation, right? And I think that's actually more clarity. And if you don't ask, you might not get the answer to that, right? But I would say follow up twice. If you first time around, probably say email, within 1 to 2 weeks. If you don't hear back, maybe call after 3-4 days. And then if you don't hear back after calling, maybe one final email. But after that, I mean, that's pretty much, I think, unfortunately, that's ghosted. So,
yeah. And it's also a small world, I mean, sometimes you may have like a bad experience with a candidate or with a recruiter, but one should still keep like the communication channel open, because who knows, they might move into a different company that you want to interview for now. And so what are your tips? Matthew, I'll ask you first. What are your tips to be able to keep this communication channel open based on the discussion that we've had so far, somewhat concluding things that we've discussed and adding to it too?
This brings me back. Okay, yeah. So I would say, even if you've been ghosted, don't take that personally, and then still keep that person in mind, because you never know. Maybe something personal happened, something happened on their end in terms of the company or the hiring manager, and in the future, you don't want to burn any of those bridges in case you run into the recruiter again, a different company that you like you mentioned. I've had some candidates where they went all angry about the process because I didn't respond within 24 hours, which is kind of unreasonable if I'm working on 30 requisitions and there's 10 plus candidates per. And he basically burned his bridge to my company. For sure, he got internally, for some people, if stuff like that does happen, most people might not know that we have an internal kind of red list or a blacklist, whatever you want to call it, whether it was a very rude experience with a certain candidate. So those are things that people keep in the system on your profile. So you might not want to have that on yours. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that just keep it professional, and then keep the open communication, even if you might have been ghosted. And it is rude. I get that. And from your perspective, that's very rude. But you never know in a small world, and especially depending on your field, it could be a very small world, and people talk. I know in marketing, digital marketing, if you get a bad rep in industry, it's really hard to find a job, because people speak, especially if it's a small, tight-knit community in certain industries, for sure. And then obviously with larger ones, it's easier to hide, but you don't want to burn any bridges that you might potentially, because you never know, that person could be your manager one day. You never know, right? So, yeah.
And specifically, I mean, because I'm sure that if someone's been here for a while and then they've been through multiple interviews, they've worked in different companies, they understand the process even more. But coming back to newcomers, international students who may be applying for their first jobs here, there are also other factors like a background check, which may or may not take longer than what they've experienced in their home countries, or say a salary negotiation, sometimes. So there are these factors as well. Rebecca, are there some tips or some thoughts that you'd like to share based on these other factors too, that may or may not affect the timeline, or something that you want to clarify or inform the audience?
I just wanted to add a little bit just more on what Matthew's point is,
Sure.
Actually, just if that's okay. I know that we didn't touch a little bit too much on candidate ghosting, but just in light of being red listed or blacklisted, it is very important to also make sure that it's not just on the recruiter side, but on the candidate side as well. So if you are having issues with the position after a while, you may no longer be interested. If circumstances have changed, if you have found another position, or any kind of personal circumstance happen on your end, please do let us know as well. It's also not ethical to also ghost us, just because it is also respectful of our each other's times as well. So I think that just in terms of building that relationship, I think it does have to be mutual in terms of respect, and not being confrontational. I understand that could be rude sometimes and kind of calling someone and go, hey, I'm no longer interested, but I'd rather you be upfront with us, and have us build that relationship for the long run than actually burn that bridge. Because like Michael said, like Matthew said, I think that there is actually a lot of, unfortunately, it is a very tight community, and burning a bridge with a recruiter that can be your gateway to so many different jobs, from the junior level all the way out to the VP is a very, very bad decision. So I am being very honest on this event here, but this has happened quite a bit, and even up to final rounds or not even showing up for the job on the first day. So, these kind of circumstances, I think that it is unacceptable. And unfortunately, we will not work with you again. So I am saying that very clearly, that it is very bad, to be able to do that and not communicate with each other during that point. Okay, so I want to just kind of just put that out there.
You read my mind there, honestly. That was something that I was just about to come to, that, it happens on the candidate side too. And it also ties back to what Matthew was saying earlier, that you don't want to be rude, but you don't want to burn bridges too. So if you don't communicate your reasons at the right time, then you're just leaving room for so much confusion later, misunderstandings. You may just be blacklisted for other interviews in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think just going back to that point on the background checks and all that, sorry about that. So I do think that to answer that question, that can take long, right? Education verification, there's also criminal credit checks, depending on kind of what you need. Those things can take time, and especially if your references are international. We've had to reach out to people during Ramadan once, and that was overseas, and unfortunately, they were not available. So, that was another week in the delay before we can even give out an offer letter, right? So I think that you do have to kind of keep that in mind, that can take a bit of time. So always have your references ready.
Yeah. So I can only hope that we were able to answer all the questions that people had, and they were able to understand very well as to how the hiring process happens in Canada, learn the different ways that they can communicate with recruiters. But before we conclude the session, I'll come back to the two of you. If there was one thing that you wanted to tell newcomer audience who apply for jobs, what would that be? Your, say, a tip or something that you have a request, right? Maybe something that they don't know and you'd want to tell them that keep this in mind. If there is like one last tip that you'd like to share, Rebecca, from you, what would that be? Yeah, it could be a message too.
Yeah, so the main message is to stay positive. As much as it sounds very overwhelming in terms of the process and how daunting that is, there's one job for everybody, right? And if things are meant to be, it is meant to be, right? And I think that you just have to really have confidence going in and being yourself, and really just kind of embracing that process and not taking a lot of things personally. The more that you're negative in your mind, that attracts that attitude, right? And I think that it affects your persona during the entire process, and it is a lengthy process. So I think that making sure that you're mentally well, making sure that you're physically well, and that you're ready. Job search is a huge undertaking, it's a very big life change. So I think that you just have to really take care of yourself during this time and take a break, if needed, because these processes are very lengthy, and getting declined at that last stage sometimes can be very discouraging. So I don't actually, encourage one to keep going and on and on and on and on, right? But take that break if needed, right? And then when you come back refreshed, you can definitely get through this, and I know that you will all find something that is, commensurate to your experience.
Thank you for sharing that. Matthew, your last tip to the audience?
Kind of thinking is very similar to Rebecca, and besides positive outlook, but I think perseverance and persistence. There's multiple people where they're very persistent in either applying to the same company or reaching out and having that casual conversation, and some of them have become my colleagues, which has been a very great pleasure to be working with some of those individuals. So I think persistence and perseverance to add to that, because it's not sprint, it's really a marathon when it comes to job hunting. It's a full-time job. When you say I'm looking for a job, putting the time to write those targeted resumes, finding the right keywords. So I think the one tip I always give is, if you have a word that's very similar in your resume and it's on the job posting, just switch it up. If it says recruiting, I put recruiting. If it says talent acquisition, I just switch up the talent acquisition. It's to help with the keyword search, whether it be a robot you might be tricking, or it might be the hiring manager who's reading to make sure that because they wrote it in a certain way, a certain language, that you should try to mimic that. And that, I know it takes an extra 5-10 minutes to edit your resume, but that little extra effort might help you land that first interview, right? And just like Rebecca said, that positive outlook and positive attitude helps, because I'll admit, some people I've interviewed in the past, they have a sense of desperation or negative attitude. Like, this is the 20th time I've interviewed. Like, you don't want that negative energy in your interview. You want to push that aside and show up with a smile, and do the best you can, right? And it really is about that match. I always equate to long-term dating. Find the right job, find the right mate is kind of similar. So you in your younger years, you date around to figure out what you want in a potential partner. Same thing with job hunting, right? With switching jobs or interviewing, you learn what you like, you learn what you don't like, whether it be a company culture, management style, that's a good fit for you for the long run, that's beneficial for you, right? At the end of the day, right? So.
That's a great analogy right there. And with that, I thank the two of you for joining us today, being panelists of this session and sharing your experiences and so many tips for our viewers. I'm sure that a lot of people here would be thinking that they get you as their recruiters based on the chats that, and the things that they've heard from you today. So thank you so much for joining us for this session. With this, we've come to the end of this session, which was all about decoding the hiring process in Canada. We organize a lot more chats like this several times a month as part of Café New Canadians. To know about our upcoming events, chats, you can follow us on social media. You can also follow us and view our content on YouTube and subscribe to our newsletter as well. If you're on YouTube, you can also hit the notification bell to be reminded of whenever we have a new video coming up. Thank you so much. We hope that this was a good session for you, and you can share your feedback with us in the survey that will pop up when you exit this chat. Thank you so much, and happy interviewing and happy job application to everyone.